All right. Hope you guys all got your exams in. I believe everybody's are in. If you had any problems, of course, email me and I'll see if I can, what I can figure out about that. But thank you guys all for your hard work. So we will dive into this week's lecture on Congress. So this week we will do just one lecture on Congress. This is usually one of my longer lectures because I have spent most of my career working for Congress. And then next week we will do the presidency and have our second quiz. So I think maybe we just have one more week with 2 lectures. So hang in there. We'll get through this semester. And if you have questions, email me. I'm happy to help. All right. So at your talking about Congress, your book starts out talking about what's at stake in the Senate's obligation to give advice and consent to the president. So the Constitution says the president can nominate with advice and consent of the Senate a Supreme Court nominee. This is very vague. It was intended to be very vague. They wanted to put a legislative check on presidents while keeping the primary control in their hands. So in February of 2016, Justice Scalia passed away, and Majority Leader at the time, Mitch McConnell, is a Republican, and said that the American people should have a say in this replacement. It was an election year, so you may remember the 2016 elections. President Obama was finishing up his term, and that's when President Trump was running. Majority Leader Mitch McConnell obviously was conservative. Obama, the president at the time, would have nominated a liberal. And he said the Senate is not even going to have hearings on this until after the November election. So he effectively blocked the president from getting a nominee into the Supreme Court. It was a very big deal at the time. I was actually working in Congress, and we were all kind of on pins and needles about what's going to happen. Is this going to be allowed? And it was. What does advice and consent mean? So Obama nominated Merrick Garland, who is now our Attorney General, by the way, who was left, but not way left. But conservatives didn't give in. Most people agree that the president serves a 4-year term and can nominate in all 4 years. But McConnell couldn't go back on his word and risk alienating Republicans. So the standoff lasted through the fall. And Neil Gorsuch was confirmed over a year later and indicates that he will vote with the conservative judges. So somehow, Majority Leader at the time, Mitch McConnell, won that standoff. So, but if politics is about who gets what and how, Congress is the center of national politics. Congress decides who gets what, but can also alter many of the rules or the how that determines who wins and loses in politics. Congress is generally very distrusted, viewed as incompetent, corrupt, partisan, at the beck and call of special interests. But as individuals, Americans like their representatives and senators and re-elect them often. I often tell people that if you want a job where somebody's telling you you're doing a good job, don't work for Congress. Nobody calls their congressman to say, great job, you did a great job on that. Everybody calls their congressman to say, I don't like the way you voted on this. I want you to do something differently next time. But when they get down to it, they tend to re-elect them. There's kind of 2 reasons for this love-hate relationship. There's satisfied constituents and a supportive party. But that doesn't always make the institution more popular. Voters want their DC representatives to take care of local and state interests and not to go rogue and vote with the opposite party. But they also want them to take care of the nation's business and look mature and deliberative. The rules that determine how Congress works were designed by founders to produce a slow and careful lawmaking process based on compromise that often seems motionless to an impatient public. The safeguards of checks and balances is often forgotten. There are 2 dynamics. The legislators struggle to keep their jobs while meeting national expectations versus our own frustration with Congress's slowness. I think I've mentioned before, I worked for a member of Congress one time who over and over again would say, when are we going to do something? When are we going to do something? It's frustrating for everybody. Elected officials perform 2 major roles, representation and lawmaking. Representation is the efforts of them to look out for the national interests of those who elect them. And then you have national lawmaking, which is the creation of policy to address the problems and needs of the entire nation. These can often conflict. What's good for us and our local community may not serve the national good. Members of Congress get reelected by pleasing voters in their district, so national problems may go unaddressed. Partisanship is a loyalty to a party that helps shape how members see the world, define problems, and identify appropriate solutions. Members of Congress have to be responsive to their constituents and to the nation, but also to their party. but it's also an important part of how they identify themselves. Constituency is the voters in a state or a district. You represent them, whether you voted for them or not. There are 4 types of representation. Policy representation, which is congressional work done to advance the issues and ideological preferences of constituents. And then you have allocative representation. This is congressional work to secure projects, services, and funds for the represented district. This used to be called pork barrel projects, for bringing home the bacon, now referred to as earmarks, which are back for the first time in a lot of years. Pork barrel projects are paid for by general revenues. They are specific for specific districts and paid for by general revenues. Earmarks are legislative provisions to allocate spending to a specific purpose or project. For example, highway construction. They were banned, earmarks were banned for a long time. The whole time I was working for Congress, basically, we couldn't use the term earmark. Republicans banned them in 2011. In the Republican House rules, Obama promised to veto anything involving earmarks. But this year, actually, they got brought back. And in my work as a lobbyist, it's been really fun to have them brought back, because we get this huge bite at the apple for our clients. So it's been a really interesting year for that. It's been a very slow process, though, and a very big learning curve for everybody. Casework is the third. Casework is legislative work on behalf of individual constituents to solve their problems with government agencies and problems. So, for example, if somebody's having a problem with immigration, or you want to send a flag that's been flown over the Capitol to a local high school, this is usually done in the local office, not in DC. They have what's called a franking privilege. This is the privilege of free mail service provided to members of Congress. Now, this is not just like, hey, I'm going to just stick everything in the mail, like all my Christmas cards and things like that, my personal stuff. It's not for personal use. It's very much for only for use of the member himself. A lot of times we would send out an update to our constituents, kind of a little newsletter. But social media actually is being used more and more here, and this is not quite as effective as it used to be. And then the fourth is symbolic representation. This is the efforts of members of Congress to stand for American ideals or to identify with common constituency values. So, for example, like a member of Congress may speak at your graduation. Sometimes they try to speak colloquially, dress like others around them. I am one of you. You can trust me. I worked for a member of Congress one time who was a very wealthy businessman, and I had a really hard time trying to explain to him that, like, when he's going to the state fair, he doesn't need to be wearing a suit and tie. You need to dress the way other people around you are going to be dressing. And that's part of this symbolic representation. Identify with the people around you. National lawmaking. Congress must create laws that serve the common good. This is a collective responsibility. Congress should be responsible for the effectiveness of its laws in solving national problems. There are a variety of factors here, guided by conscience, ideology, demands of constituents, interest groups, party positions. They can be at odds with representation, making it hard to fulfill collective responsibility. We want a Congress that focuses on the nation's problems, but as voters, we tend to reward members for putting constituent concerns first. Now, partisanship. Hyper-partisanship is a word that we use all the time right now. It's a commitment to party so strong that it can transcend other commitments. We're very hyper-partisan right now. You are very much a Republican or you're very much a Democrat. There's not a ton of in between the way that there used to be. The polarization is the ideological difference between parties and the ideological homogeneity within them. Because of this, it's hard for compromise to really be effective now. It kind of goes out the window. There have been many government shutdowns. In fact, there may be one later this week. The government runs out of funding on September 30th, and you may have seen in the news that they're having a lot of problems getting everybody on board. So a government shutdown is when there is a refusal to pass a continuing budget resolution that allows the government to continue operating. They're usually fighting over something besides the actual keeping the government funded. Right now, they're fighting over, in 2013, they fought over Obamacare, and they shut down the government for 16 days about it. In 2019, it was a 35-day long shutdown, and my husband and I both worked for government, and neither one of us had a paycheck for those 35 days, so it was really tough, and when we started applying for jobs in South Carolina. That shutdown was mostly over Trump wanting to build the wall. The shutdown that we may be having right now is over what's called budget reconciliation. So President Biden really wants to pass his sort of social agenda, and he's doing this through a term called budget reconciliation, which this is not in your textbook. This is just kind of what's going on in DC right now. There are a number of members of the Democratic Party who are not on board with this. They want other priorities passed first, and so they are kind of putting their foot down and saying, we may shut down the government, we may do other things until we can kind of get our priorities across. So it's compromise is really difficult when we're in such hyper-partisan times. The founders gave Congress a lot of power, but it really couldn't have imagined the scope of contemporary congressional power since they'd never anticipated the growth of the federal government to today's size. They were more concerned with the representation of short-term popular opinion and less with the conflict between like a local and national interest. Congress has both the House and the Senate in it, and each Congress is numbered. I think we are in the 117th Congress right now. Each gets a 2-year cycle because the House gets elected every 2 years. We have a bicameral legislature, a legislature with 2 chambers, bi meaning 2, and it's laid out in the Constitution. We wanted 2 chambers to serve as a restraint on each other, strengthening checks and balances. The smaller, more elite Senate would cool the passions of the people represented in the House. They are equal in their overall power. They can both initiate legislation, but tax bills are supposed to begin in the House. They both must pass every bill in identical form before it can be signed by the president to become law, but there are a few extra responsibilities assigned to the Senate. Some of the biggest differences, obviously there are 100 members in the Senate, so there's not as many formal rules needed. You serve a 6-year term in the Senate, but on a staggered basis, so not all are elected at the same time. They can suspend their campaigning for 4 or 5 years to focus on the nation. They must be 30 years old, older, wiser, better able to deal with national lawmaking. Actually, Chuck Grassley from Iowa is 88 years old and just announced that he's running for re-election for another 6-year term. So they are often a lot older, especially older than 30. They were originally elected by state legislatures, but it was changed in 1913 to have the Senate directly elected by the people. The House of Representatives has 435 members, so they need more rules and hierarchy to function effectively. In fact, they were just debating a defense authorization spending bill earlier this week, and there were over 800 amendments to it. So they had to put it in front of the Rules Committee to have a different committee kind of knock that down. If they had 435 members debating 800 amendments, it would take forever. And so they need a lot more rules and structure. They serve for 2-year terms, and they basically never stop campaigning. And you only have to be 25 years old. And there are a lot of members of the House who are a lot younger. Budget bills are supposed to originate in the House, but the Senate does have to pass them as well. The House has the power to impeach, but the Senate does the impeachment trial. You may remember this from both of President Trump's trials. I had a good friend who worked on those. Both Andrew Johnson and Bill Clinton, and now Donald Trump, were impeached by the House, but the Senate failed to find the president guilty of the charges brought by the House. Only the Senate is given the responsibility of confirming appointments to executive and judicial appointments. The founders were really concerned with executive tyranny, so they granted Congress the bulk of the lawmaking power. The Congress has the responsibility to pass laws, but they don't become a law unless the president signs them or refrains from vetoing them, or both houses are able to muster a full 2/3 majority to override a presidential veto. The president cannot vote or even introduce legislation, but his annual State of the Union address allows him to recommend such measures that he shall judge necessary and expedient. And there's something called congressional oversight. This is a committee's investigation of the executive and government agencies to ensure they're acting as Congress intends. I actually worked for the Oversight Committee, was my last job in DC before I moved to South Carolina. And we oversaw all of the different agencies. Actually, we oversaw the USA Gymnastics investigation into Larry Nassar, which was really interesting. And this oversight is usually done through hearings and selective investigations of executive actions. It's essential for Congress to be certain its will be carried out. Other checks and balances, the requirement that the presidential appointments, cabinet posts, ambassadorships, this must be made with the advice and consent of the Senate. And by consent, this is the constitutional obligation that the Senate must approve certain executive appointments. Sometimes the Senate can use their power to do more than advising consent, but like we saw with Gorsuch and Mitch McConnell, it can really tie up appointments for political reasons. Some of the differences in constituencies: the president and Congress look at policy in terms of a national constituency and their own policy program. For example, the president may say, "We need a clean air bill," but a member of Congress may say, "That means a closing a factory in my job, in my district, and there'll be a lot of jobs lost, and I'm not okay with that." So it's a difficult balance there. Congressional elections. So the House is elected every 2 years, the Senate elected every 6. This takes up a lot of time. A lot of aspects of Congress is designed to aid the reelection goals of its members. A lot of this is the way a district is drawn. It can determine success. Obviously, we just had, we're going through some redistricting right now because of the census. So the Constitution says each state will have 2 senators. This is easy. And the House will be allocated on the basis of population of a state, which fluctuates over time. Reapportionment is the reallocation of congressional seats among the states every 10 years following the census. So we just had the 2020 census. These 435 seats are reallocated after the 2020 census. So we're kind of going through this reallocation right now. States who have population who grow gain seats. Those who have populations who shrink lose seats. In the 2010 census, South Carolina gained a seat. We didn't in the 2020 census. So how do we count people? Most people, a lot of people don't want to fill out the household questionnaires that the Census Bureau sends out. What about poor people, homeless people, immigrants who maybe aren't usually counted because maybe they're afraid to fill it out? Democrats really want them to be counted because they usually vote as Democrats. Republicans fear that it will be added to the Democratic representation. So redistricting is the process of dividing a state into legislative districts, trying to keep the districts relatively equal in population, one person, one vote. The average district size in 2010 was a little over 700,000. This can turn into a bitter political battle because it's carried out by state legislators. How the lines are drawn has a lot to do with who gets elected. Gerrymandering. This is redistricting to benefit a particular group. It can result in some really strange shapes by the time state politicians are through. There are 3 types of gerrymandering. Partisan gerrymandering, which is redistricting controlled by the majority party in a state's legislature to increase the number of districts that the party can be expected to carry. So they want to draw it to make it a very Democratic area or a very Republican area. In the 2010 census, a lot of Republicans had a great deal of success because of the shapes of the way things had been drawn. It gave them a lot of the majority in a lot of states. And then there's something called pro-incumbent gerrymandering, where legislatures agree to create districts to enhance the electoral security of the current members of both parties. And then there's something called racial gerrymandering. This is redistricting to enhance or reduce the chances that a racial or ethnic group will elect members of the legislature or members to the legislature. So for example, you can draw a district so that where mostly African Americans live, and so we want to definitely have an African American representing that district. So it can be a good thing or a bad thing. It's a very, very controversial. The Supreme Court is really struggling to find a fair set of rules on drawing district lines. Do you think a geography is a better basis for congressional representation than race, gender, religion, occupation, or socioeconomic group? Just because you live in a certain district means that you're going to likely have a certain representative? I don't know that there's a better answer. Okay, so you've decided to run for Congress. There's no educational requirements. You don't even need to have graduated from college or even high school. There are lighter job qualifications than most jobs you'd apply for when you graduate. You guys probably are more qualified now than you would have to be to run for Congress. Obviously, you're not old enough yet, but you have to prepare yourself to be exposed to the critical scrutiny of your prospective opponents and prospective constituents, which makes it so that a lot of folks do have higher education and additional requirements. Why would somebody want this job? That's a good question. Some are motivated by the desire to serve the public. Some are motivated by ideology, the commitment to enact policy that represents their strongly held values. They make about $174,000 a year, which makes them a top wage earner, but it's really not. You must consider that they must maintain 2 residencies, one in DC, which is very expensive. That is not a lot of money for DC, and then one in your district back home. DC is very expensive. This salary doesn't cover it for a lot, and some members of Congress sleep on a cot in their office. Some of the perks include a travel allowance. This is not a generous travel allowance, just being like, I'm going to Europe for the weekend. It's to fly you back to your district for the weekend. You have votes in DC, usually maybe Monday through Thursday or Tuesday through Friday. You get to go back to your district for the weekend, and you have a travel allowance so that you can do that. It allows for, the book says, ample staff, which is funny because it feels very generous to be described that way. There weren't very many of us in each office, and members of Congress have staffs that are always extremely overworked. Franking privileges, the privilege of sending out mail to your constituents. The book says you get free parking at Reagan Airport. Actually, you get free parking in a lot of places. There's a little card that you can put in the front of your car that sort of keeps you from getting parking tickets. You can't just park willy-nilly, but you don't have to obey as many laws about that. Laws, traffic, whatever. Health and life insurance and a pension. So the book mentions that being a perk. Now, this is only if you work there for a certain amount of time. Theirs is exactly the same as mine. You have to work there for a certain amount of time before you vest, before you get a certain type of pension. The health insurance that they get is Obamacare, the same as the type of health insurance that I got when I was there. So I feel like that kind of gets blown up to being like, oh, what a cushy job. You get this awesome healthcare plan and this awesome pension, but it's not anything super special. Job security is non-existent for anyone, members of Congress, for the staff. No matter how hard you work, you're sure to face an opponent in the next election who claims you didn't do enough, and it's time for a change. So you have to work harder, raise more money, and be more popular just to keep your job. This is hard on families who either divide their time or live without one parent for part of the year. Many become disenchanted with the job. The level of conflict is so high, and bitter partisan infighting is so rough that it makes it not much fun. We've lost a lot of what I would consider really fantastic members of Congress because of this. What it usually takes to win. You usually need political and financial assets. You need experience. Political amateurs without previous experience rarely win unless they're already famous or extremely wealthy, like Donald Trump. Strategic politicians, these are office seekers who base the decision to run on a rational calculation that they will be successful. Is this a district or state that I can win? Who is my opponent going to be? Can I get the funds necessary to run a winning campaign? What kind of year is this? Some years are good for Republicans, some are good for Democrats. If it's a presidential election year, the enthusiasm for a popular presidential candidate might sweep fellow party members to victory in the coattail effect. This is less significant lately. So the coattail effect is the added votes received by a congressional candidate of a winning presidential party. And then there's something called midterm loss, which I very much expect to see in the 2022 elections. This is the tendency for the presidential party to lose congressional seats in off-year elections. So because 2022 is not a presidential year, it is a year that we will have congressional elections. But because we had a Democrat win in 2020, what usually happens, almost always, is that a lot of Democrats lose their seats and Republicans win that year. So if a Republican had gotten elected 2 years ago, the Democrats would win, 2 years later. But because a Democrat won in 2020, it is likely that the Republicans will win in 2022. That's just historically how it's happened. This is it's happened since every midterm election except for 1934. So there are some unusual midterm loss patterns, exceptions, but they're very unusual. So being a representative. So today we assume that the representation requires Congress to some degree reflect the demographics of American people. This is descriptive representation, the idea that elective bodies should mirror the demographic population that it represents. Founder John Adams said the representative assembly should be in miniature, an exact portrait of the people at large. It should think, feel, reason, and act like them. Congress fails at this pretty miserably. There are a lot of old white men still are. Congress is dominated by lawyers and business people. There are, in the United States in general, only about 26% are college grads, and only about 8 to 9% have advanced degrees. But in Congress, over 3/4 of the members of Congress have an advanced degree, and their income is well above average. Many are millionaires because this is who can afford to move to DC and maintain 2 homes and lives and campaigns. Women and minorities are not typically well represented in Congress, but it's more representative today than it has been. Until the 1960s, civil rights until the civil rights in the 1960s, there were hardly any blacks or Hispanics in the House. Women did a little bit better because of the common practice of appointing and sometimes electing a congressman's widow to office. But in 1970, women started getting elected up by their own in more significant numbers. And obviously, Nancy Pelosi is the Speaker of the House. And then Kamala Harris is our Vice President. So women are coming to their own as candidates as a natural extension of their progress in education in the workplace. Does it matter if Congress looks like the people it represents? Probably. Having one of your own often takes the form of being more informed. Maybe you have a higher sense of efficiency. Sometimes you have a higher voter turnout, and we don't know if it actually produces better policies, like for a woman to have a woman or racial minority who looks like you, but it does help getting folks out to the polls. All right. So the official business of Congress is making laws and the rules that determine where the power is and who can exercise it. Congress is organized along party lines, and in each chamber, the party with the most members decides the rules for the chamber and gets the top leadership posts, such as the Speaker of the House, the Majority Leader, and the Senate, the chairs of all the committees and subcommittees. The majority party is the party with the most seats in the House, or in a House of Congress. Party is also important because it's the mechanism for members' advancement. All positions are determined by the party, and members have to advance within their own party for positions of power in the House or Senate. Parties stand for different things. Obviously, Democrats are more liberal, Republicans are more conservative. But like we talked about, it's hyperpartisan and very polarized. Party polarization is the greater ideological, liberal versus conservative differences between the parties, and increased ideological consensus within the parties. Today is very hyperpartisan. Almost all Democrats are very liberal. Almost all Republicans are very conservative. It's hard to compromise. Leadership. Majority and minority parties elect their own leaders within their party themselves. The Constitution provides for the election of some specific congressional officers, but Congress itself determines how much power each chamber will have. So the main leadership offices are the Speaker of the House, the Majority Leader, and the Minority Leader, and the whips. The Speaker of the House, who is Nancy Pelosi right now, and she's a Democrat, is the leader of the majority party who serves as the presiding officer of the House of Representatives, elected by the majority party and the most powerful House member. The Senate is similar. The presiding officer in the Senate is actually the Vice President, who can cast a tie-breaking vote when necessary, which is very important right now because we need that tie-breaking vote. It is a 50-50 split right now, so you have to have a tie-breaking vote. I say we, I'm not saying like we as I'm a Democrat, I'm just saying we as in you can't have a 50-50 split. The presiding officer in the House is less powerful where the debate is tightly controlled. Focus in the Senate is a majority leader and the minority leader. Each is advised by parties on both policy and personnel matters. And both parties have what's called a whip, which comes from an old English hunting experience to put the whipper in, charged with keeping the dogs together in pursuit of the fox. They are charged with finding out how members intend to vote so they can adjust the legislation, negotiate acceptable amendments, or employ favors or threats to secure votes. There is going to be a vote on Monday in the House on a bipartisan infrastructure bill. There has been a lot of information out there about who is whipping which way right now. A lot of pressure being put on folks to vote a certain way or the other because they have whipped yes when they should whip no. They have whipped no and they should whip yes. And so it really puts a lot of pressure on them. Leaders can exercise power, only the power their members give them. There's seniority, the accumulation of power and the authority in conjunction with the length of time spent in office. The committee system. Meeting as a full body, it would be really hard for the House and Senate to consider and deliberate on all 10,000 bills and 100,000 nominations they receive every 2 years. So this is broken up and sent to committees. The Constitution says nothing about committees. They are completely creatures of the chambers of the Congress they serve. The longer service on a committee permitted members to develop an expertise and specialization on a policy area. So you want to kind of be on a committee for a while. But what do committees do? They work out the nitty-gritty details of legislation. They consider alternatives and draft legislation. They are the primary information gatherers of Congress. They hold hearings, staff reports, investigations. They act as the eyes, ears, and workhorses of Congress. They do more than write laws. They also undertake in congressional oversight, like I talked about earlier. And this takes a lot of time. They often are a fire alarm when there is a scandal or an upsurge in public interest to direct them to a problem within the bureaucracy. There are 4 types of committees: standing committees, select committees, joint committees, and conference. A standing committee is a permanent committee responsible for all legislation in particular policy areas. I have worked for the Small Business Committee, the Judiciary Committee, and the Oversight Committee. These are standing committees. They carry on from one Congress to the next, and they review most legislation. There is the House Rules Committee. I mentioned this earlier. It's the committee that determines how and when debate on a bill will take place. I mentioned there were 800 amendments to this piece of legislation this week, and it was up to the Rules Committee to determine which amendments would be heard. The rules provide a rule for each bill that specifies how and when it will be debated, how long the debate can last. Because the House is so large, debate can be endless if they didn't provide the structure. And then there's something called a select committee. It's a committee designed to deal with an issue or a problem not suited to a standing committee. For example, in 2014, the House Select Committee on Benghazi investigated further what happened in Benghazi. They're having investigations on the January 6th attacks now. Joint committees are combined House and Senate committees formed to coordinate activities and expedite legislation in a certain area. And then you have something called a conference committee. When the House votes on a bill and the Senate votes on a bill, there may be some tiny differences within the bills. So they have a conference committee that meets to work out those differences, to have one bill to take to the president. The conferees are usually members of the committees that wrote that bill. So getting on the right committee is really important. A lot is done at the committee level, and it's important for your re-election to be on the right committee that can best serve a constituency. So deciding on who gets on what committee varies by party and by chamber, usually rewards those who support party positions, but accommodates members the best they can, since the goal is to support ranks and help find success. Seniority remains important today. But the chairs of the committee serve at the pleasure of their party and caucuses and party leadership. The vast majority of congressional staff work for individual committees or members is done at the staff level. Representatives have about 17 staff members, but a lot of those are back home in the district. And the Senate has about 40, and again, a lot of those are back home in the district as well. They do legislative work and constituency service, which is usually located in the district. Interns also supplement full-time staff. If you guys are ever interested in doing an internship in DC, please let me know. I'm happy to get you set up. Committee staff does a lot of the committee work, and each member relies on their staff a great deal, giving them a lot of influence. Congress is reluctant to be dependent on the executive branch for information, and so they've built some of their own research organizations, like the Congressional Research Service, the Government Accountability Office, and the Congressional Budget Office. A lot of times before we would vote on a piece of legislation, we wanted to see what the CBO, Congressional Budget Office, score was on something. It would give an estimate about how this particular piece of legislation will be influenced by tax and spending policies. Policies are both a result of external and internal forces. External are problems important to citizens at any given time. The president proposes, Congress disposes of important legislation. The Constitution requires that almost all congressional policy has to be passed in identical form by both houses, which is difficult because they serve different constituencies and operate differently. It makes it hard for a president to take a large-scale coordinated approach to major policy problems because of this. Some of the norms of conduct, these are informal rules that govern behavior in Congress, are to work hard, develop a specialization, treat other members well, reciprocate favors. This aids in getting business done. What about how does a bill become law? What a question. There are very few ideas that actually make it into law, and those that do have a very difficult path to follow. A friend of mine just posted on Instagram this week, I have worked in DC for 15 years, and this is the first piece of legislation that I've gotten signed by the president. It's a lot of work. A legislative agenda is a slate of proposals and issues that a representative thinks would be worthwhile to consider and act on. Sometimes can be triggered by a well-publicized event. Maybe a member finds it in his own interest to invest time or political resources in it. This is often called policy entrepreneurship, the practice of legislators becoming an expert at taking a leadership role in specific policy areas. A bill has to be introduced by a member of Congress, even if it's the president's idea. The formal introduction is by putting the bill in a wooden hopper in the House, where it goes to the clerk of the House or the presiding officer of the Senate, and then it's given a number, like HR 932 or S 953. So the bill introduced in the House first goes through the House and then through the Senate, and then vice versa. Sometimes they can be considered simultaneously. The bill is referred to committee. Then they move to subcommittee, which may or may not get serious consideration. A lot die here because the committee members don't care about an issue, or if it's not on their agenda, or maybe they'll actively even block it. Even if a member doesn't seriously believe their bill will pass, sometimes they just want it to be seen back home as they took action on it. They introduced this bill, even though they knew it was going to go nowhere. Bills that subcommittees take up will have hearings. They'll hear testimony from experts, interest groups, executive departments, and secretaries, other members of Congress. They'll deliberate, send it back to full committee. They'll further consider the bill, make changes and revisions in a process called markup. And if a committee votes in favor of the final version, it goes to the House floor or the Senate floor. The bills go from a standing committee to the Rules Committee, like I mentioned earlier. They give each bill a rule. An open rule is any amendment can be proposed and added as long as they're germane. Most appropriations bills are this way, which is what's going to be taken up this coming week. So staff dreads appropriations time because that means a lot of long nights. More typically, leadership gains control by limiting time for debate and restricting amendment that can be offered, which is called a closed rule, and it gives you a little more control over things. The Senate guarantees all bills have an open rule by default, thus senators have access to the floor for whatever they want in a way that's denied to the House because there's fewer of them. The Senate has a tradition of unlimited debate, which means each member can talk indefinitely. Senators opposed to a bill can filibuster, in an effort to tie up the floor in nonstop debate. A filibuster can only be stopped by cloture, which is a vote to end Senate filibuster. It requires a 2/3 majority or 60 votes to be stopped. Often senators would read the telephone book, or Ted Cruz read Green Eggs and Ham one time. You don't even have to be talking about anything relevant in order to adhere to rules of constant debate. Then you could use what's called the nuclear option. This is a controversial Senate maneuver by which a simple majority can decide to allow a majority to bypass the filibuster for a certain kind of votes. They try not to do that anymore. Some unorthodox lawmaking. Sometimes congressional leaders deal with a logjam of bills by packaging them together in an omnibus. We see this a lot of times in spending bills like we're dealing with right now. It contains so many important elements that a member can't afford to defeat it, and the president can't afford to veto it, even if it has few things in there that they don't like. How a bill becomes a law, it can be killed or left to die in subcommittee, full committee, rules committee, any of the committees in the Senate, and then it has to be voted on both floors of the houses. Multiple ways to vote in the House. You can have a simple voice vote. All in favor say aye, all opposed say nay, or there can be a roll call vote. This is a publicly recorded vote on the bill where the clerk of the House calls your name and you either say yay or nay, and it is publicly recorded, and they have a public record of how you either supported or did not support. They have a little button they can push for it too. You don't actually answer yay or nay. A lot of times you just push your button beside your name, so it pops up on a screen. Technology. The president can veto, obviously, a bill, and Congress can reverse a presidential veto by a 2/3 vote in both houses. The president can also kill a bill with what's called a pocket override, which is his authority to kill a bill submitted within 10 days of the end of a legislative session by not signing it. In 2016, a lot of Americans were really angry with government, and they targeted their anger at Congress. The media attention doesn't help, but there's a really intense partisanship in contemporary Congress and repeated legislative crises as parties are unable to compromise. Does it make a difference that Americans dislike Congress so much? I don't know. I mean, we talk about reforming things like term limits, but term limits might work if there was evidence that people serving in Congress actually corrupted a good person. But Congress, and we also deal with campaign finance laws, which we've looked at a lot. But how will this fundamentally change how the public feels about Congress? Congress has conflicting goals of representing constituents, working together to solve national problems, and operating as a member of opposing partisan teams, which these often and necessarily conflict, which is fascinating up close and so much fun in DC, but it's kind of ugly to an average citizen. All right, guys, this is a long lecture. I'm sorry I went so long, but I think this is really interesting. If you ever have any questions about Congress, I'm happy to answer them. I still sort of work in that world. Actually worked in Congress for most of my career, and it's a really fun and interesting time for me. Email me if you have any questions, and I'll be back next week with another lecture. Thanks, guys.